This is the eLearning Podcast, episode number 65.
I always call myself Miss Movement. Anything that moves, I tend to teach it, and anything that deals with the body, and that's my area of research.
Welcome to the eLearning Podcast. My name is Laddick, and I'm your host from lmspulse.com. Let me ask you something. Do you sometimes feel like we've all been sitting in front of our computers for almost 2 years now? Well, now imagine what dancing, gymnastics, or performing arts teachers are going through. While there must be a great deal of frustration, there's also interesting questions and ideas about our physical bodies in the digital classroom. Things like, how do we keep ourselves active? How do we approach things like dance and theater? And does e-learning open new possibilities for physical outcomes? For my guest today, the answer is a resounding yes. Dr. Rachael Jefferson-Buchanan is a lecturer in human movement studies and creative arts at Charles Sturt University in Australia. In our discussion, she tells us what human movement studies is all about and how it's transformed for her over the past 2 years. Rachael and I also talk about how digital learning can actually open new spaces for physical education with possibilities for more creativity and intimacy. We also talk about why the rise of TikTok, with its emphasis on video and dancing, teaches us some valuable lessons in the way we approach topics involving our bodies and movement in general. And then finally, while online education obviously has its struggles and challenges, we also talk about ways to promote physical self-care and well-being, despite the disruptions of delayed or asynchronous interactions. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The eLearning Podcast is sponsored by the eLearning Success Summit. Learn from more than 40 experts how to teach, work, and learn online without being overwhelmed. Get your free ticket to the summit at elearningsuccesssummit.com. And lmspulse.com, your best source for news, information, and resources for e-learning professionals for more than 10 years. Get our free roundup of the week's top news at lmspulse.com.
Hello, Rachael. Welcome to the eLearning Podcast. How are you today?
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm well, thank you.
Awesome. Rachael, everyone knows that I'm sitting here in Mexico City, but you're on the other side of the planet. Where are you sitting today?
A long way away. I'm in Australia. I live on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, the two different states where we're having COVID battles at the moment between states, in a lovely place called Albury-Wodonga.
Albury-Wodonga. I'm going to have to look that one up immediately. That's fantastic. So, the next question I want to ask is, I use the podcast as a small time capsule about what's happening with COVID over the last sort of 18 months here. What is the situation in Wodonga? You said that you're on the border of the battling states. What does that mean?
So because we're such a huge country, we have lots of different states a bit like you in America. We have lots of different states and they all have premiers and they all have different rules and regulations. So we always have a bit of a laugh and get quite frustrated all at the same time here on the border because, we have what they call a border bubble and we deal with both because our students live in Victoria. They come into schools in Albury. They have lectures in Albury. They go back out to Wodonga to go home. So there's all of this issue that we have, and we're seen as a sort of gold standard country on some levels because we've had so few COVID deaths, and we've managed to control everything here. But long story short, I think we've struggled with Delta. And consequently, we've had some major lockdowns. And I think we're known right now in Melbourne for having the strictest and the longest lockdown in the entire world. So that's what we're living at the moment.
Oh dear. I think that we need to compare that with the Philippines and some other places where they've been locked down for a long time. But regardless, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it. You are a lecturer in human movement studies. And I'm so excited to even figure out what that means. But the reason why I wanted to have you on the show is you and I started a conversation on LinkedIn And, we just sort of was reaching out to, find podcast guests and whatnot. And you came back with just a lovely response. Just said, I really just don't think e-learning is really delivered in my space all that well. And I wanted to talk about that because I am a fanboy for e-learning. Obviously, everybody knows that, but we need to hear the other side of that because there are these other pieces to it. And so let's start there. What does a lecturer in human movement do? Human movement studies.
It's interesting because I started with that title here when I first came here to Australia 9 years ago, and since then I probably do more creative arts than human movement studies. It essentially means that anything that I always call myself Miss Movement, anything that moves, I tend to teach it, and anything that deals with the body. And that's my area of research as well. And anything that deals with health and physical activity and dance and everything else. I actually am usually the person who's dragged into either design subjects or teach subjects. And those subjects are quite an interesting mix here in Australia. So we have what we call online subjects, we have hybrid subjects, and we have or blended subjects, and we have face-to-face subjects. And generally my work over the years has tend to focus on more face-to-face teaching in health and physical education. My background is in health and physical education, but I'm also a specialist in dance. And so I sort of started out with that. And then over the years, things have, because of the situation in universities in Australia, where there's more of a kind of neoliberal framing of things, and demographically as well, there's a lot more online teaching. And so I tend to find that the teaching that we do face-to-face is gently being sort of guided to more of an online or hybrid space as opposed to just face-to-face. So that's been an interesting development with my teaching, where I've had to sort of think about creative ways of making movement even possible to learn in a digital space.
Fantastic. So what was life like before? I guess, you just kind of described it. What I'd love to get to is, how was your practice affected by COVID? Was it full online and sort of everything kind of stopped? Was there sort of this, hey, wait, let's just take a pause for a second and see what happens? Like, what kind of happened in your particular practice?
Well, it's interesting in the sense that if we look at the 9 years that I've been here, as I say, there has been that gradual push to blended and online subjects anyway. But with practical subjects, as I mentioned to you in our online communication, I've always struggled on the level of how do we actually reciprocate what's going on in a face-to-face class, where there is this innate humanness, where we're actually moving and sensing and feeling and being. How do we actually put that into an online space and have the same kind of quality of learning? Because in the end, as an educator, that's where I sit very, very, very strongly is, can it be reciprocated? How is the quality of what I teach and how I teach? How is it changed? How does it transform? Is it a better quality online? And so when COVID came here, as I said, we already had quite a lot of hybrid and blended subjects. But we never had one particular subject that I teach across 5 different campuses with 5 different tutors that I work with as what we call a convener role. Always did it face to face. And so we taught every single one of the creative arts here. So we start with visual arts, we move to music, we move to drama, then we move to dance, and then we do media arts. So we've got these 5 different art forms, and the whole subject is about the discipline of the creative arts. And so it's not about the teaching. And when you have that flip, as in you're an educator, but you're teaching the discipline of something, I think that's where we get these big challenges. because what we wanted the students to do was to actually embody everything and to actually experience doing dance, doing art, doing drama themselves, so that they could be in the place of the learner and they could actually begin to feel the anxiety. Some of them feel dreadful anxiety. They bring all sorts of baggage with that from their school experiences, so that they could actually go through the processes of creating something and working with others and talking and collaborating and all of those wonderful kind of social constructivist things that we would expect to happen in an educational space, face to face. And what we had to do suddenly, we sort of did the first 4 weeks. We did 2 weeks of visual art, and they were in there and they were printing and they were, bringing objects in and they were having discussions with each other and so on. And then we did music, and I brought in all the percussion instruments, and they were listening to Aboriginal stories, and we were making soundscapes together based on these Aboriginal stories. And there was so much sort of, to and fro, and that lovely hum of exchanges that we did. And then bang, the walls came down and they said, you need to transfer everything online. And we were in week 4 of a 14-week semester. And we still had these other 3 big subjects to do. And I just was like, whoa, how are we going to do this? I've still got, how am I going to teach dance online? It's just not drama, media arts. Well, media arts possibly, but not dance and drama. It just doesn't work. And so I literally just sat down and scratched my head, and probably ended up having a fit of anxiety about it all as well. As I remember, it's all a bit of a blur, so it probably wasn't an anxious moment. And then I just said, well, we don't, I do practice a lot of mindfulness and yoga myself. I said, well, we can't change what's happening. And in the end, I sort of calmed myself down. And I said, well, what we might end up doing is sort of like having these, we can't do a 3-hour workshop. It just doesn't work. What we were doing was a 3-hour face-to-face, and that breaks up the attention span of the human being. And that collaboration and all of that to and fro is possible in the longer session. And my experience of digital learning is really an hour is probably the most that a student withstand. I mean, that's even pushing it. And even that, you've got to frame it so that there is chat, so that there is, a possibility to have questions, that you're not just delivering something, because they're not going to listen for an hour. We know that. And so I thought, well, maybe if we just knock back those 3 hours, we squash them down to 1 hour, and we have this just literally an online chat and take them through some of the learning activities that they might have done with us in a classroom space. And then we tell them how they can transfer that into their home space. So we talk them through the creative process. We get that questions and chats. We might be able to have, lots of humor and like I was getting them to make up name rhymes and write them into the chat and things like this, My name's a bit difficult for that. But they came up with things. Rachael, she likes to dance. And things like that. So we did that, and then I just gave them the capacity, because they're older students. I said, well, now you go away and you do the equivalent of 2 hours work on your own creative product, and you do it either online with a friend, or you engage your family or your partner at home. So your new digital partners in that creative space could actually be your kid, your auntie, your neighbor, because you're allowed to have these COVID bubbles, etc. So that's how I flipped it for the next sort of 10, 12 weeks. But not a space that I particularly think was ideal, but it was an emergency situation.
Were there any unique or surprising or interesting outcomes from those assignments, that things that happened that you didn't expect, or wonderful things that kind of came out?
Yeah, I think so. I think there was, as I've mentioned, I think there's a mix. I think that some students actually, they were quite honest, and they said, that they brought a lot, which is pretty common in creative arts. They brought a lot of anxiety. So for some of them, it was a better space because they didn't have to get up in front of others, and they could do it in a safer space at home with a few friends or family, etc. And therefore, they were in charge and they were in control of how they created products for the assignment. So that was interesting feedback, because we had subject feedback at the end as to how we did. We also had some students who found really creative possibilities. And I don't know if you know TikTok.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Well, I didn't know TikTok very well.
I have a 13-year-old. I know TikTok.
Oh, okay. Well, my children are a bit older, so they're not really into TikTok. They're adults. I think it's quite a teenage thing. I don't know. That's my impression anyway. But I hear there are adults there who are engaging a great deal as well. Anyway, I've never been on there, but because we were in this situation where a lot of learning was online, several of them asked me, because we had these set assignments where they had to work with others and they had to create these particular products and then note their creative process. And one of them was an absolute rip-roaring success. And she went on to TikTok and she did the most amazing product. And I was moderating it. And I was just like, wow, this girl is amazing. She's taken COVID and she's just transformed it into this beautiful creative space from home. And all she did, she told me what her creative process was in her assignment, because that's what they're supposed to talk about. And she went into her wardrobe. It was such a funny thing. I'll never forget it. She went into her wardrobe and she took out, but they always say we only wear about 10% of what we have. She took every single item of her wardrobe. And she said there were more than 40 pieces of tops and T-shirts and skirts and trousers and so on. And she got her partner they went out into the garden and she put on a different outfit from her wardrobe. She had them all lined up on the bed and she put on all these different outfits, and he filmed her doing that. But every time she put on an outfit, she did a different dance move or whatever. And so she had this amazing amount of these tiny little stills where she sort of made an action and then put on a shawl or, whatever. And then she joined them all up and she put this beautiful, interesting, really crazy music to it as well. And she put it on TikTok. So it was available there. And I said, wow, that actually would never have happened if we hadn't had COVID. She would have been in a classroom with me and we would have done a group dance together and they would have gone off and made their own products and so on. She chose her own stimulus, which was the clothes. The wardrobe became a stimulus. And B, she chose how she filmed it. And C, because of the fact that she didn't have much space, she had to go into her garden. She had to sort of transform that space into a performance space. So her garden became this performance space. So yeah, things like that were really, really beautiful to witness. I think we could probably have hours and hours of conversations about how people have used COVID as the opportunity. What about the other side of the coin? I mean, did you have to find yourself, as you said, you're a yoga and mindfulness practitioner. So I'm sure that you brought that into your lectures and those types of things. Did you find yourself coaching, mentoring, providing additional support that you wouldn't to others that maybe who didn't find that immediate outlet or weren't able to channel their anxiety in that way? Yes, definitely. I teach another subject, which is called Wellness and Wellbeing. And that's an online subject. And it was a new subject for me. I hadn't taught it before and someone else had written it. And I was sort of obviously experienced in that area. But for me, it was like trial and error, sort of I'm teaching this online and I want to bring in the practice. And there wasn't any practice. It was all theory and delivery of lectures, and then following online modules and completing learning tasks and being in a forum. That's where it was. So part of my role as the convener was to actually to have these weekly tutorials where I just had sat down and had a chat with students who wanted to come. And I thought, well, rather than, because I knew what was going on, and it was a year into the COVID situation here, and there were a lot of students that I knew had lost jobs. Casual jobs were very scarce. Either they'd lost a job or they couldn't get a job. There were family issues. There was online homeschooling going on. And a lot of the students that we have are older students. They're working in early childhood, and they were juggling family and work and everything else. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to dedicate, once I've had my online chat with them, I'm just going to dedicate 15, 20 minutes to a wellbeing space for them. And so that became a mindfulness, not a compulsory, but an optional end. So I kind of squashed down the tutorials, which were an hour. And I said, okay, now becomes this optional space where you can either say bye and go and take your own space, your well-being space, in the way that you want to, going for a walk or whatever you want to, but try and keep it as a 20-minute well-being space, even if you're not with me, so that we're actually practicing what we preach. Because educators and teachers, we often don't do a lot of self-care, and we often give out so much to others. So try and just lock down this, I hate to use that word, but try and lock down, because we were having a lot of those space for well-being. And so I led this, and I said, no visuals, no sound, just zone out, and you can lie down, you can stand up, you can sit with me, you can just find this space with me. And I would just go through very simple activities such as body scans, visualizations, kindness practices, compassion practices, just sort of real basic mindfulness. But I would squash it right down to, rather than being a 40-minute practice, a 15, 20-minute practice. And I would do it myself. So the thing about mindfulness and yoga is that, you are actually, particularly mindfulness, you're actually supposed to be in the zone of doing it yourself, because then it becomes more of an authentic space. And then also students will tune in with some of your rhythm and your breathing and your pace of doing it. And so that's what I did. And I did that for 12 weeks. And students, gave a lot of positive feedback. And they said, we've never thought about looking, this is dreadful to say, but, we've never thought about looking after ourselves before we give out to others. And this whole subject has been a revelation, because it's sort of like a beginning subject for them, that we can't go on and on giving out if we don't actually look after ourselves. So that was very successful as an online practice, through digital. It was really interesting. But I said, I will always prioritize practice where I can, because I believe that there is this false dichotomy between theory and practice. Theory is practice and practice is theory. And the online space offers a challenge, but it also offers an opportunity for us to at least try and do those things. But coming back to your original question, I think that was successful because it was quite sedentary. I think that when we bring in, I had a few disasters with dance, when you bring in music and you've got dodgy internet, and you're also trying to move and get them going and doing things, and they're sort of seeing you slightly later, and you're trying to do this unison, hey, let's go, let's do some 1970s, sort of whatever sequence together, TikTok, whatever it is, and they're like, Rachel, we can't get you. You're in a different rhythm zone, or maybe we should do this later, or when we're alone, or So those challenges were a nightmare, and I realized that we had to really focus on quite simple things.
Sure. Yeah. What about, so two questions, going back to the mindfulness delivery, did you find, especially because of the positiveness and the positive outcomes from it, was there an increase in a demand for that class, or have you now sort of had others start to come, and even maybe other professors come and say, hey, how can I incorporate this into my class? That kind of thing?
Well, I think I'm a bit known for being a bit of a hippie.
You said it, not me. I knew that.
Yeah. in what I wear and what I preach, I try to practice what I preach, and I've had a huge, as many of us have had a huge amount of upheaval and trauma and stress in my life. I've lived in 3 different countries. I've had a lot of family losses and so on, and so I have had to find my own well-being spaces. And part of my well-being spaces in the last few years, I've been doing yoga for many years, 15, 20 years, but mindfulness was an enhancement of that practice. And so teachers know me here, and lecturers know me here. We don't call them professors here unless they're way at the top of the scale. We call them lecturers, but they know of me and they know what I'm trying to do. And so I would say I've been roped into quite a lot of stuff. I wouldn't say I necessarily volunteered. They kind of, word gets out what you're doing quite quickly. And so I ran for the whole of the COVID year last year. That was where it was really, really intense. And we went online, all of us. I ran a staff weekly workshop, which started out as only being 4 weeks. And it was called a mindfulness and right workshop. And it was for staff only, not students. And they asked me to come in because they knew my background and just run a sort of a practice, and then we'd all go off and write and do some research. We'd come back, we'd discuss, and then we'd do another 5-10 minute practice, and that might involve mindful movement. So it's doing some very gentle practices while moving, and that even mindful walking and things like that. And so I did that, and it was so sort of enjoyed that everyone said, can you just carry on? And I was like, oh, okay. So for a whole year. And then I said, oh, now that we're back face to face this year, maybe I'll drop that, because staff were sort of in and out and they were a bit sort of busy. And then interestingly, there's a gender and feminist network here, a research group. And then we went back online in May, June here, and they were doing everything online, and they said, oh, can we bring you back? So I think there's possibilities there, and the beautiful thing about what I do is that I feel like it's also good for me. We all need to stop. We all need to find some stillness in the day. And as much as I'm very much pro movement and being very physical, I feel as though that can often be a mask for the need for us as human beings to actually sit with how we're feeling and feeling uncomfortable, feeling comfortable, feeling blah, whatever. We need to just sit with that. And so doing it for others and doing it with others enables me to actually do a bit of extra practice as well, which is really lovely. And it creates really interesting relationships with people online, because there's a sort of sense of trust that comes through. And that, once they turn their screens off, I don't know what they're doing. They could be having a cup of tea. They could be ignoring me. They could be doing some crazy whatever and just pretending to do it. But in the end, it doesn't matter, because there's a sense of community that you can create just through some of those embodied practices.
Speaking of a sense of community, something I didn't ask at the beginning was how large is, you said 5 campuses. So how large is the school that you're teaching at? Like, what kind of student body do you have?
Oh, yes, it's big. We have more than 40,000 students across different campuses. So when we teach subjects, they kind of vary quite a lot. During our Christmas time, which of course is our summer, during Christmas subjects, which are designed to be just online, we have subjects where we have up to 240, 250, sometimes more students online. So big classes. But then we go right down when we're face to face. We have a maximum of 30. So it's quite interesting to navigate that space, because you do get to know your students really well when you only have 30 students face to face for 14 weeks. And they get to know you as well. All your quirky ways and your sense of humor and your different moods that you have as well. And I'm a bit of a theatrical person, so I always try to dress in a certain way as well for a certain class. If I'm teaching a visual arts class, I'll wear really bright colors and scarves and earrings. Whereas in the online space, that can be a bit lost, can't it? You don't have that intimacy, and I feel like it's less of a performance in a way. I also feel as though it's much more intense, and in a way, sense of humor sometimes can be a bit lost. You try your best, but I realize you'll see as I'm talking, I'm very much a physical person when I talk. Must be the Italian in me. But it's that stereotype with the hands and the explaining and what have you. And I've worked in very multicultural environments in Geneva. I was in an international school there for a long time, and there were non-English speakers, and so I'm used to being very articulate and using hands and demonstrations and so on. And I feel as though that sort of is lost a bit online. And let's not forget also that some students actually don't want to ever show their face. Sure. And they don't want to engage with you. They don't want to speak either. Some of them, I sort of call them lurkers. Yeah. They want to just be there and experience it. But they don't actually want to A, speak, B, show themselves. And they very rarely even type in the chat as well. And so as an educator, I feel in my second subject, special needs, and I'm very much pro-inclusion. And I don't mind that. And I always set up my online classroom, and I say, quite similar way to my face-to-face, and I say, anything that you're not comfortable with, anything that you feel as though you need to step back away from and just pull out for a while, that's perfectly acceptable. However, and I always say this, you are future teachers. And so you need to understand that you will have students like this as well. And that actually sometimes, and that comes from my mindfulness training, sometimes being in that uncomfortable space, we can learn a huge amount about ourselves. So I invite you to join in if and when you feel you can, or if you would rather be a director or a choreographer or whatever, then at least you're involved in some way and you can talk about that in your assignment and feel what it's like to be on the outside as opposed to, being an insider. But yeah, I like to have that sort of space as opposed to, I know some lecturers are a bit tougher and they say, right, on everyone, and
it's interesting, especially for younger learners, especially at sort of the K through 12, sometimes the school has that criteria to keep the camera on simply because the teacher has such an important role in maintaining the classroom and these kinds of things, right? Especially with younger students. So with adult learners, I think that you have a more leeway. You have a bigger space mentally and socially to kind of work within. Whereas with children, there's a little bit more, a little bit more of a box you have to put it in. Otherwise, they will color outside those lines pretty quickly, so to speak. Yeah.
What about
you're
right. Yeah, it's difficult.
Go ahead.
Well, no, it is difficult, I think. I think it comes back to us knowing our students. And if we know our students really well, and we know that, Joe Bloggs is going to really, really struggle with full-on face-to-face intensity, particularly with, our ADHD students and so on. It's too much. The visual stimulation is too much for them for the full hour. So I think in the school space, they have quite a tricky job. You're right. They have to accommodate the students' needs in a more explicit way. Where we give them more choices because they're adults. So yes, but I think we do have to be extremely careful with children with special educational needs at all ages.
For sure. Absolutely. I'm interested in your practice and how you found this with your students over the last year. How much did you change up your space for delivering your classes, on a regular basis? Because for me, I'm a creature of habit, right? And I think many people one of the success, how do you create success with this is create a space where you're not worrying about your technology and your microphone and whatnot, right? So you can kind of come in, turn on, and you're delivering your stuff. But for someone in human movement and creative arts and whatnot, I'm feeling like there needs to be a bigger palette of options. Is that something that you discovered or not?
I like the way you use palette. Very appropriate for creative art. I sort of, it's an interesting evolution. I've been in teaching now for 32 years. And so I think that has had a huge effect on my level of anxiety in what I do. And I am, because I am so experienced, and I've been teaching online now for nearly 10 years, and that's pretty normal for me. I set up things and I'm extremely organized, like hyper organized. I've got my PowerPoint, I've got all my dot points on it. I've got my internet links ready to click on and show them things. And so everything's there. But I'm also a bit of a strange creature on the level of that, but I'm also an artist. So for me, I love that chaos, and I love that creative chaos that can emerge. And I love improvisation too. Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of dance and drama and so on in music. And so for me, I think it's about creating that balance of, yes, you're prepared, and yes, you have your PowerPoint slides and so on. But things often go wrong. And I remember clicking on this link for a TikTok dance thing that I was showing the students. And I was okay, now we're going to have a look at these three guys, and they're doing this really good piece to ABBA. And I thought you could take it as a possible stimulus. Click, the link goes on, and it didn't work, because it was early days and I hadn't done it much, online with links. Live. This was live. Of course, they've got links within modules that you've set up in that asynchronous space. But when you move into the synchronous space and you're there dealing with live things, they go horribly wrong. And so I'm a great believer in humor, laughing about it and saying, "Oh well, that was a major fail, wasn't it?" What I invite you to do is, at the end of this workshop, is click on that link and have a little practice at home. Mm-hmm. It's really just a minute. And then when we come back next week, can you bring your feedback to me about how that link went and what you thought of the dance? So let's move on swiftly. And so I believe that although we are super organized, many of us as teachers are complete and utter control freaks on some levels. We're great organizers. We're known to be great organizers of people and places and what we do in terms of the learning space. We also, as we gain experience, we tend to let the reins go quite a lot. And we have more of an improvisational space. And I've often talked in conferences and things like that about how, as teachers, we actually are performers. all of us are performers, because we often don't go in and tell them all our daily woes. We go in and we put on this, although we're authentic, we put on this performing space. This is my teacher hat, and this is what I am. So I guess that's some of the things that I've experienced.
Oh.
It's a balance. It's a balance.
Final question for you, Rachael. I always end every interview like this. And the question is, what are you now looking forward to over the next 6 or 12 months, either in your practice or a shiny new object or a new process or something happening that you think just sort of needs to be noted out there for people who are listening right now?
Well, that's a really good question. I've got a couple of things. I think we always have to have little goals, don't we? I think for me, I'm post-PhD now. So I finished my PhD a couple of years ago now, and we went straight into bushfires with all the stress and the disastrous happenings here in Australia into COVID. So we literally slipped into those two disasters. Mm-hmm. And as though my research went on the back foot. And although I've been writing and publishing and so on, for me, it was like, I've got so much to say about what my PhD was. And my PhD was all about power. Mm. It was all about the regulation of the body through physical education and the discipline that involves, the power discipline, and how through the physical, we teach children certain techniques and so on. And it has a lot to do with not just the body. It has to do with making sure that they are regulated, self-regulated, that they take personal responsibility for their bodies and their health, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a kind of greater social good that my PhD was revealing as to what we do in the school context with power. And so what I'd like to do, because of what's going on in Australia right now with government and ruling authorities and power, what I'd like to do is actually do some research where I sort of analyze what's going on with COVID and government and the kind of the regulation of the body through lockdown and the kind of evidence base for what went on, and then sort of look at how people's well-being has been affected. And so what I'd really like to do is run some surveys and some interviews and so on, and then get some word out there about how health is actually bigger than an infection. It's just, I often talk about biomedical discourses and how as a nation and as a world, we have really prioritized the biomedical discourses. And what I'd like to do is unpick why we prioritize that as opposed to our social well-being, as opposed to our emotional well-being and our bodily, our embodied well-being, and the whole idea of being, we're allowed out for an hour a day to be active. Well, actually, we know that as human beings, we need to be active throughout the day, and that doing that 1 hour is a regulation of our body. And so that's what I would like to explore on a research level, why those decisions were made and what do we mean by this what actually happens to our well-being. It gets lost amidst all of those kinds of narratives.
Rachael Jefferson-Buchanan. I hope I just said that last name correctly.
Yeah, you did.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was truly fascinating. I loved hearing your stories, and I really look forward to hearing what that research project yields when you do get to do it here in the near future.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the eLearning Podcast. If you like what you heard, please do me the favor of following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or whichever social media you prefer. Also, if you're interested in diving deeper on e-learning, I encourage you to get your free ticket to the eLearning Success Summit, where there are more than 70 hours of presentations on best practices. Just go to eLearningSuccessSummit.com. And then finally, for the latest news, information, and resources about eLearning, come subscribe to our newsletter at lmspulse.com. Thanks.